Hey, welcome back to our channel. We want to thank you for joining. Hopefully you all are doing really well. We've been feeding you with the diplomatic engagement between the country of Israel and that of Iran. As we all see, the Middle East at the moment is boiling. However, Africa is paying attention. It's important for us to continue to talk about the importance of the continent of Africa.
So I think that, we're of two minds of Africa here in Washington. There are those who see a lot of opportunity, and there are those who just see it as problems in need of resolution.
So Africa knows where it stands, and it can continue, more importantly, to showcase its engagement and making sure that it looks internally.
I think you said this before, we still harbor a lot of paternalism along with the Europeans towards Africa. We tend to look down at Africans. We tend to see it as a place where we send aid and not treat them as equals. And so we have to be sensitive to those criticisms.
At this moment, the continent of Africa cannot always be informed again, or we cannot tell the continent that you are on your own. You have to start making sure that you pick up yourself and really strategize yourself and build a solid, bulletproof collaboration and partnership. In this episode, I put together the importance of the continent of Africa and why Africa cannot be ignored anymore. Let's play the clip. If you are joining us for the first time, we want to thank you for watching. In this episode, I will be diving into the reason why Africa's geopolitical importance cannot be ignored anymore. I will be looking at some specifics here. I will dive into geopolitics, illustrating Africa's most important geographic locations, why Russia, China are vying for the continent in terms of partnership and strategic development. More importantly, Europe and the United States of America ignoring Africa at your own peril. I will illustrate like you have never before seen. I would encourage you to watch this video to the end for clarity and better understanding. So without any much delay, let's just dive straight into it. The continent of Africa's strategic importance increases by the day. It is amidst a population boom and is richly endowed with natural resources, including those that are critical to the high-tech industries of the world that is expected to drive the future global economy. Especially before the COVID-19 pandemic, the continent had many of the world's fastest-growing economies. Geographically, Africa is only narrowly separated from Europe and the Middle East, and it sits on three of the global's primary shipping checkpoints. Among them are the Red Sea and the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, the sites of the recent attack against vessels that have tripled shipping costs of some routes. 17 submarine data cables, and some of which connect Europe to Asia and also transit the Red Sea, making it one of the decent and also densely collection of subsea cables in the world. If you look at other aspects, because of the continent's size, the African group at the United Nations General Assembly has significant voting power. This has practical relevance given that some of the United Nations specialized agencies, such as the International Telecommunication Union or the International Civil Aviation Organizations, are norm and standard setting bodies. African countries, relatively recently colonial past, also grant the African group a moral authority that enhances the continent's diplomatic influence. So, like I said, Africa, it's a very vital and important continent, and those particular geopolitical partners that understand the relevance of the continent of Africa will continue to work together. But some other imperialist partners who still see the continent of Africa as a raw material zone will continue to be condescending, paternalistic, and disengaged. So for that reason, those who engage the continent from the win-win perspective will win the game, and no question. Let's play the clip. If you look at the geopolitics at play, some of Africa's primary competitors understand Africa's importance and conduct their foreign policy accordingly. China is the continent's largest bilateral trading partner and lender, and one of its largest source of foreign direct investment, the FDI. Of its triennial Forum on China-African Cooperation, which routinely attracts nearly every African heads of state. With two exceptions, the Chinese foreign ministers had made Africa his first international visit of the year, each year for the past 3 decades. Beijing strongly promotes China's constructions in the African continent, and partly by requiring that Chinese companies implement most projects it funds. Because of this, Chinese firms have built important infrastructure across the continent of Africa, including government buildings, ports, and also great majority of telecommunication networks. China also selects Djibouti, perched on the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, to host its first overseas military base. If you look at the strategic importance of the continent of Africa, considering the portion with regards to Russia, Russia's interaction with Africa goes back before the collapse of the Soviet Union, as we've pointed out on this channel. Russia is increasingly asserting itself on the continent. Its Wagner Group, now known as the Russian Expeditionary Corps, has embedded itself in strategic and also lucrative areas in countries like Libya, Mali, and also Central African Republic. More importantly, Russia's presence may have contributed to the expulsion of French forces from several countries in the Sahel region. Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov visited African continent 4 times in the last year and a half, and Moscow's other diplomatic initiatives, such as last year's Russian-African Forum and this year's Forum on combating neocolonialism, gathered African ruling parties and heads of state. This is in addition to increasing Russia's African trade over the last 15 years, a recent flurry of military agreements, and continued weapons sales in other strategic areas with regards to the Africans' need in various areas to defend their own territory in several ways. So, like I said, the continent of Africa is at a crossroad at the moment, because for that reason, Africa must choose its partners carefully. For those geopolitical partners who do not understand the continent of Africa, because these nations go to look for new partners, they start behaving in a way that cutting aid and making sure that they want to sideline the continent of African nations. So this doesn't sit well. And for countries like the United States of America that has failed to engage the continent of Africa, not just this administration, in the previous administration, as we saw South Africa and Egypt and a whole lot of other partners across the region came under tremendous pressure. So the continent of Africa will continue to look for those partners and to make sure that those partners that can help it solve its challenges at the moment will be those that are worth working with. Let's play the clip. If you look at aspects, African countries are making the decision to select their own partners. This hasn't gone well with regards to other Africa's geopolitical partners in Europe and the United States of America. Reversing these negative trends for the United States of America's interests will require longer-term reforms to Americans' foreign policy. For instance, reorganizing the focus of American engagement in Africa to motivate and facilitate the U.S. private sector activities on the continent.
If you ask people, the young entrepreneurs, what is DFC, it's not a household name. So I think, as excited as I am to see what will be unveiled, I'm actually more excited to see if they will be talking about scaling up what already exists. In other words, what does Power Africa do? What are the major projects that Power Africa has delivered?
Yeah.
What's the major project that Prosper Africa has delivered or has helped negotiate or so on? So that's something I always wonder. But the other thing that we've been hearing a lot as we engage with scholars and the press and others, is China the driver behind this summit? Or Russia, for that?
I think the answer is yes and no. I think a lot of things are driving this summit, right? I think certainly China's the elephant in the room because they have really gone in very aggressively, and let's be clear, like, it's been 20 years that China has been developing these ties. The FOCAC, the China-Africa Summit, has been going on for 20 years. You know, they are not new to this game. And so for us to just now be kind of waking up to the inroads that China has made, I don't think that's a fair assessment. I think we've been kind of aware of this. I think one of the big wake-up calls for Washington was the UN vote on condemning Russia's invasion of Ukraine back in April. I think there was a kind of assumption, maybe even a laziness on the part of U.S. officials that, of course, Africa saw the situation the way we saw the situation, was that this was a totalitarian state attacking a democratic state.
Good guy, bad guy.
Yeah, I mean, I think for us it was really black and white like that, and I think there was a certain shock when Africans expressed a different view on that, or at least a more nuanced view. And this has, I think, been a wake-up call to Washington that if you want to be the leader of the free world, then you have to be able to rally the free world around these issues.
Right.
And they weren't able to fully rally African states. And African states expressed a lot of discomfort about having to choose why they should be choosing Washington as their preferred partner for business, for security, for, you name it.
So this entire approach that Africa's geopolitical partners like the United States of America and other fringe powers across the European Union always put African nations on the spot and are asking them to make decisions. We saw that the Russian-Ukrainian war, how South Africa came under incredible pressure. We saw the United Nations, how a number of African countries voted differently, like Eritrea and the rest. So this particular aspect where African countries are treated differently, it's a huge issue regards to US's administration. It's important to know that African nations are facing challenges and must make their own decision on their own on how it fits their nations and their citizens. Let's play the clip.
That under the Trump administration, Africa was not given the attention it needed. In fact, it was derided and insulted on many instances, and that we have a lot of work to do to get back to where we were, even 10 years ago. That there has been a drift in U.S. policy, and that the United States doesn't look like the same reliable partner that it once was, and also begin to rebuild some of the lost trust that we have with African countries.
So the lost trust, you think, is this a product of the years after the collapse of the Cold War, that the U.S. has continued to, let me put it this way, my sense is the U.S., the biggest impediment to U.S. engagement in Africa is the United States. It's not China, it's not Turkey. Africa is open for business. There's no single African country that I know of that says, we don't want Americans over here. We don't want your presence here. We don't want your company. Every single one would like to see America's leadership. Not just leadership in the ways that you describe the various issues, leading on peace and so, but really leadership in come work with us, be partners. Stop asking our questions about Chinese and Turks. There's absolutely, so my view, and I'll be curious to hear what you think, is because of all the lenses that you've mentioned, the various perspectives that are wrong or not seeing clearly what is in front of us. So often businesses will say, well, there's no rule of law over there. There is no this, there is no that. The entire risk, Fitch or who's giving the rating out of New York, right?
Yeah.
But so what is it that the Chinese are seeing that we are not seeing, obviously? Risk is risk. What is it that the Turks are seeing? So this entire notion, we spent a lot of time in a place like Washington talking about great power competition, which frankly I don't see. I mean, if there's a great power competition in Africa, the US is definitely not one of the competitors, right? So maybe if we take the exception of Djibouti, where you see the Chinese, the Americans, the French, and the Turks, yeah, that's a very microcosmic setting and it's very unique to Djibouti. But for the rest of the continent, you actually see the ascendancy of Turkey, and its soft power. They're building stuff, they're building roads. It's not just the Chinese. You go to places like Kampala, in Uganda, you go to DRC, you go to other capital. Not only you see this work, physical work that the Turks are doing, but then you see the big Turkish international schools. There was a time where it was all the American international school, the French international school, the Brits. Now you have Galaxy School in places like Kampala. You go to Kinshasa, you have École Internationale Turque and so on. Then you have Turkish Airlines, which becomes like the big shuttle that Africans are using to get around. So it's my sense that with all the stuff that we're talking about, Russia, get a question of Russia, what are they doing? Well, you study Russia in Africa. It's pretty small, and there's nothing new there. I mean, maybe the novelty is Wagner Group. But everything else that the Russians are doing, the stuff they've been doing over the last 60 years. Would you agree that the U.S. is actually primarily its own impediment in engaging with Africa? Well, if so, to what extent?
We've actually been involved in Africa since the Cold War ended, right? The AGOA program was rolled out under Clinton, PEPFAR under Bush, the Malaria Initiative under Bush, the Millennium Challenge Corporation, Prosper Africa, Power Africa. I mean, I think we have all of these kind of signature development programs, and many of them are now coming up on 25 years old, right? AGOA, 25 years old. PEPFAR coming up on 20 years. So that's a real that's a real staying power that has enjoyed, I think, all of those programs a lot of bipartisan support, right? I think the interesting thing about the Chinese is if you read, so China released a strategy for Africa, not unlike the Biden administration did. They released theirs about a year ago. But if you read that strategy and then you hold it next to the Biden's, it looks very similar. The language that they use about partnerships is very similar. What's interesting about China, I think, is that China sees Africa the way it saw itself 30 years ago. It sees a large, developing continent with huge potential, just like it was 30 years ago. It sees a growing youth population, just like it had a generation and a half ago. And so it is connecting to Africa through a shared experience. Right? And so what I hear from Africans is that, when we come to China for a summit, everybody gets their 15 minutes with President Xi, right? And we are treated as equals. We are not talked down to, we are treated as equals. And I think that in this day and age, that's really what Africans want, and that's where Washington has to get to. And we have to be sensitive to the fact that in many cases, the Chinese are getting it right. I mean, they are treating African countries with a level of respect that they have traditionally not been afforded. We make it a big deal, and I wrote this in the piece that you and I wrote the other day, right? Which is these kinds of summits and these kinds of meetings, they can't be extraordinary. They have to just be matter of course.
Correct.
They have to. I mean, if there's going to be a success in this relationship, is that this kind of thing becomes boring. It becomes just another thing that we do on a host of things that we are doing to engage in the continent. Right. The fact that it is so extraordinary is actually part of the problem, I think.
Correct. And the problem goes back. Of course, President Obama, when he hosted the summit in 2014, could have hosted the summit in 2015. He could have hosted another one in 2016. I'm still wondering why that didn't happen.
For those in the policy corridor in the United States of America and European partners that are dealing with Africa to ignore the current situation in the region, why Africa is so important and possess important strategic importance for the region, whatever way you put it, African countries have emerged. They are beginning to make their own decision. If you consider Africa's geopolitical partners in Europe and the United States of America, it's important that Africa is approached in a manner that provides the continent with regards to its importance. Africa really wants to do business and open its corridors to deal with other foreign partners. However, the continent's importance can never be ignored, as we've pointed out. Hopefully, we've informed you with regards to the importance of the continent of Africa and why China and Russia are strategically placing themselves in the region. We want to thank you for watching. Let us know what you think with regards to this particular importance of this continent of Africa. Leave us your comment and keep the conversation going. If you are new to this channel, we encourage you to watch some other informative videos on the YouTube channel. We are looking forward to meeting you soon in our next episode. Have a good day. Bye-bye.